If you've ever tried to make a decision and found yourself going in circles, thinking about it, feeling into it, second guessing it, and ending up more overwhelmed than when you started, that's not a lack of clarity. That experience, where something initially feels clear and then becomes confusing, is very predictable once you understand what's happening underneath it. It's what happens when multiple inputs are active and there's no structure for working with them. When people describe this, they usually call it overwhelm. But that word hides what's actually happening. Overwhelm in this context isn't just too much. It's multiple internal inputs arriving at the same time with no clear order of priority. Last week, I talked about the 4 ways intuition tends to show up: body, emotional or relational awareness, cognitive clarity, or direct knowing. Most people are working with more than one of these, and that's not a problem. The problem is not the number of inputs. The problem is what happens next. Let's walk through what this actually looks like. You're trying to make a decision, something simple or something important, it doesn't really matter. You start to notice your body has a reaction. You're aware of how this affects someone else. Your mind starts organizing reasons, and there's a quieter sense underneath. Each of those is information, and at first this doesn't feel overwhelming. It actually feels like you're being thorough. You're noticing what's happening, you're taking things into account, you're trying to make a good decision. But very quickly that shifts. Because instead of those inputs organizing into clarity, they start layering without resolving. And that's the point where the experience changes. Because without a way to work with them, they don't organize themselves. They stack, they compete, they interrupt each other. It doesn't feel like 4 different inputs. It feels like pressure. It feels like yes, but also no. This makes sense, but something's off. I can see the direction, but I'm not settled in it. And when all of that is happening at the same time, your system doesn't register that as useful information. It registers it as conflict. And conflict is hard to stay with because it doesn't tell you what to do. It just holds multiple directions open at the same time. So instead of working with that, most people try to resolve it as quickly as possible, not by understanding it, but by reducing it. Let me give you an example. You're deciding whether to move forward with something. You might notice that your body feels slightly off. Emotionally, you're aware someone else is invested in your answer. Mentally, you can see both the benefits and the risk, and there's a quieter sense that something doesn't fully align. Individually, each of those is manageable. Together, without structure, they create friction, and that friction is what people experience as overwhelm. And what usually follows is a kind of internal push to get out of that feeling, to land somewhere. So you start leaning more heavily on one input, usually the one that feels the most defensible, or the one that creates the least disruption. And once that happens, the other inputs don't disappear. They don't go away. They just get pushed out of view. Here's another version of this. You're interacting with someone. Part of you is picking up that something is off. Another part of you understands their situation and feels empathy. Mentally, you can explain their behavior. And there may be a quiet recognition that this dynamic isn't sustainable. If those aren't separated, what you feel isn't clarity, it's tension. And that tension often gets resolved by staying in the situation longer than you should. Not because you didn't notice, but because what you noticed never became something you acted upon. It stayed as background information. And over time, that creates a gap between what you're perceiving and what you're doing. This is the part that matters. The issue is not that you have too much intuition. It's not that you're too sensitive. What's happening is you're receiving multiple forms of input without a way to differentiate or prioritize them. So instead of clarity increasing, it collapses under the weight of it. When that happens, something very predictable follows. You override, not consciously usually, but functionally. And that override doesn't always look obvious. It can look like explaining something away, deciding you need more time, asking someone else what they think, choosing the option that creates the least immediate discomfort. In some cases, it looks like going with what you had already decided before you checked it all. So the input is there, but it never actually gets used. And when that happens repeatedly, something else develops. You start trusting the override more than the input, because the override leads to action. It feels decisive. It moves things forward. While the original input, the one that didn't get used, starts to feel less reliable. It wasn't unclear, but it feels unreliable because it was never followed through. This is why people say, I can't trust my intuition, when what's actually happening is they're not working with it. They're overriding it when it doesn't organize itself quickly. There's a reason this happens. When there's no clear structure, your system looks for stability. And stability usually comes from logic, external validation, or urgency. Those feel more decisive. They create a sense of resolution, even if nothing has actually resolved. And that's often what people are responding to, not clarity, but the feeling of something being settled. There's another piece here. When overwhelm sets in, your field narrows. You stop taking in the full range of what's available. You focus on one explanation, one outcome, one path. That narrowing can feel like relief because it reduces the internal conflict, but it also removes information. And once that happens, you're no longer working with the full picture. That's when things start looking simpler than they actually are. One option, one explanation, one direction. But that simplicity is coming from reduction, not clarity, and not alignment. When your field is open, there's usually more than one possibility present. When that disappears too quickly, it's a sign that something has been excluded. So overwhelm in this context is not just too much. It's multiple inputs, no structure, followed by override. And over time, that pattern creates hesitation, second guessing, and loss of trust in your own perception. A well-trained intuitive can work with multiple inputs without collapsing into overwhelm. They don't reduce what they're receiving. They don't shut it down. They change how they work with it. We're not going into that here, but it's important to understand that this is a skill, not a personality trait. If overwhelm has been part of your experience, it's not random. It follows a very specific pattern. If you want to start getting clearer on how this shows up for you, the first step is identifying how your intuition actually comes through. I created a quiz that helps you see your primary pattern, what else is active, and why certain situations feel more confusing than others. I've linked it below. Once you can see what you're working with, overwhelm starts to make more sense.